You're listening to Economics Detective Radio. My guest today is Jimmy Morrison. He is an independent filmmaker, and he's currently working on two films, one called The Housing Bubble and another called The Bigger Bubble. Jimmy, welcome to Economics Detective Radio.
Thanks for having me on.
Economics is a bit of an arcane subject. What made you interested in making films about it?
Well, in 2006, I had been studying economics and entrepreneurship at the University of Iowa, and I dropped out of school to start a production company and become a filmmaker. And I had decided that I would need some way to supplement my income to get that business off the ground. And so I started a house painting business right before the crash. And so I kind of experienced that firsthand, and I already had that background in economics a little bit. And so I started listening to audiobooks while I was painting, and I would listen to, Economics in One Lesson by Henry Hazlitt. And then I started listening to economics lectures by Joseph Salerno and Murray Rothbard. And so that led to the idea that, these boom and bust cycles happen and people get caught up in these different things. And so I wanted to make sure as an entrepreneur that the next time a bubble came around, I didn't get blindsided by the crash. And so I set out and decided to interview the people that predicted the crash and ask them not only why it happened, but what was next. And so it started as one film, but kind of expanded into two once we got going with it.
Right. And there are many people who allegedly predicted the crash, but sometimes if you actually go to the thing they cite as them predicting the crash, it's like, they write a whole essay about something totally unrelated, and then at the bottom of footnote 6, they express some reservation about derivatives or something.
Right.
But with people like Salerno, he's talking about it before it happens. He's talking about the exact mechanism, and he's talking about housing and interest rates.
Right. We were able to interview economists like Robert Murphy and Joseph Salerno, Marc Thornton, Roger Garrison, a lot of the premier Austrian economists in their field. But we were also able to talk to investors like Marc Faber, Jim Rogers, Peter Schiff. We were able to interview Ron Paul, who is obviously pretty famous for having predicted the crash. We really wanted to make an economics documentary, or what is now two documentaries, not a political documentary. I think a lot of the reasons people get turned off when they hear about politics is it's a lot of speculation about what people's intentions are and what they're trying to do. And with economics, you don't really have to deal with that. We're only looking at what the effects of these policies actually are. So it kind of enabled us to stay away from being really theoretical about what people were thinking or what they were trying to do. And it allowed us to just focus on, hey, these are the problems and these are the consequences that we're having because of them.
What would you say to a person who is thinking about seeing your movie, but they already saw Inside Job and they're thinking, I feel like I've already learned about this?
Well, what I would say is that I thought Inside Job was incredibly well made. It's a very well done documentary, but it really looks at issues on the surface of them. It doesn't get to the core causes of these things. And without knowing those core issues, you have a lot of the wrong responses. And I think that's one of the problems that Inside Job had. With our film, since we interviewed these people who predicted it, they're showing us time after time how these things have happened in the Great Depression in the 1970s, the S&L crisis, dot-com bubble. Some of these people have been investors over the last 20, 30 years. Marc Faber, for example, he predicted the S&L crisis, he predicted the dot-com bubble and the housing bubble. I mean, with records like that, these people clearly have an insight that we're not getting elsewhere.
Right, so the Inside Job focused on sort of the proximate causes, the specific firms that were leveraged and were making these bad loans. But I remember watching it, and that would have been when I was still an undergrad, and leaving the film with a lot more questions than I came in with. Why it doesn't seem obvious that a business would want to make bad loans. That seems like an obvious way to lose money, and yet they did. So there's clearly something more going on there, and what the Austrians were identifying was, of course, the Fed and the credit expansion under Greenspan.
Right, and what that credit expansion does when they create all that money, it makes everybody feel wealthier than they actually are, and it makes things look profitable that wouldn't otherwise look profitable. And so it's not that entrepreneurs were just suddenly greedy, or homeowners were just suddenly really greedy, wanting to go out and get a free house. It was more that they distorted the economy to make it look like it was a good idea. And what we found is that's an unsustainable policy. And unfortunately, that's what they're doing once again. Part of the reason we're doing two films is I believe that by looking at the past and the history, people can learn the lessons they need to take away from our films. So if they just want to look at the history, they can watch the first film. Or if they're kind of the person that flips to the end of the book and just wants to, hear the punchline, they can just watch the second film. The second film starts with the bailouts in 2008 and just looks at the way they've responded to the crash. And it shows that not only did we create a housing bubble, now we're creating a housing bubble, a bond bubble, an art bubble, and we're just creating more and more debt and making problems even more and more worse. So the second film allows people to just kind of skip ahead and see what applies to them today as opposed to looking at the past.
So you mentioned you go through the history. You start. Do you start in 1920? Is that the sort of earliest point?
Yeah, we go back and talk about World War I a little bit and how the Federal Reserve helped fund the war, and by doing that, they created a distorted economy, and it had to be corrected in 1920. It's funny, I actually got an email from my motion graphics designer the other day, and he said, "Hey, I just wanted to make sure this chart is right, because I don't want to put the wrong data in here. And this can't be right that the federal government cut spending in the budget by 60% in 1 year." And I had to email him back and say, yeah, that's why we're showing it, because it's quite the contrast to the Great Depression, where we had this big expansion in the 1920s. And instead of, cutting spending to reflect the reality and correcting the distortions that were in the economy, they just dragged it out and kept trying to prop it up. And we're kind of seeing a similar thing today.
I'm reminded of Milton Friedman's Free to Choose. The only episode he really went through was the Great Depression, and he had sort of cartoon banks crumbling to rubble and then the money supply contracting. Does your documentary, of course, you talk about the Great Depression.
Mm-hmm. Well, I want to say that Free to Choose was actually, that miniseries was a big inspiration for this film. And, Milton Friedman was one of the early economists that opened me up to libertarian ideas. I would say that I go a lot further than he does now, but when he created that miniseries, it was in 1980, and it was right after we'd had, all the problems in the 1970s with rising unemployment and rising inflation at the same time. And the BBC put out a documentary kind of blaming free markets for all those problems and, blaming the rise of inequality on free markets and that sort of thing. So Free to Choose was Milton Friedman's response to that. And that kind of inspired me that, the Austrian School of Economics really doesn't have anything like this. And if there was ever a better time to educate people with a documentary, it's now. I think that, like you said, Inside Job was very popular. And if we can have people sit down for 80 minutes and be able to understand these issues, there's really no better way to educate people.
I understand that you're working with Tom Woods on this.
Yeah, he co-wrote both films with me, and he's been involved with the project since the very beginning. His book, Meltdown, and also one of his books, Rollback, were very influential in shaping the structure and the idea of what we wanted to do with the films.
So can you tell me a little bit about pitching this to Tom Woods? He seems like not just a busy guy would be an understatement. He seems like the busiest guy.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. Well, I was able to set something up with him at Illinois State University. I was in Iowa, and he was speaking at a college in Illinois. And at the time, he lived in Alabama. Now he lives in Topeka. But so basically, I went and I pitched him the project about 15 minutes before he went on stage to give a speech to, 1,000 people. And I, laid out my business plan for him real quick and filled him in on what I wanted to do. And he was really gung-ho right away. He was very excited about it. and said he wanted to do it. He got involved right away. So I actually found out later that David Stockman, who we also interviewed, he was Ronald Reagan's budget director that quit in protest of the increase in government spending that Reagan was involved in. But David Stockman had once told him, Tom, you need to adapt Meltdown into a documentary. And Tom had just laughed it off and said, oh, that'll never happen. So when I came to him, he thought, well, I got to jump on this opportunity. So it's been a lot of fun working with him.
Right. The opportunity being some eager young person willing to do the legwork.
Yeah, right. Somebody willing to drive over 35,000 miles. And when I first started the project, I'm not ashamed to admit that my first round of interviews, I was driving all over the country and actually up into Canada and sleeping in my car. And I interviewed Marc Faber in Montreal, and I had to wash my hair in a gas station bathroom and then put on a suit and walk into this hotel that cost probably, $500 a night or something to interview him. The nice thing about film is people don't see that. They just see the finished product.
Yeah, could you tell me a little bit about the filmmaking process? How many people are involved?
Yeah, so I mentioned that we have somebody doing our motion graphics. They live in Chicago. And then our main editor lives in Brooklyn, and he's been doing freelance editing for 6 or 7 years out of there. And before that, he was based in London. And he's done some really cool stuff. I'm really excited to be working with him. And so it's kind of something where you have to use a lot of modern technology because nobody lives in the same city. Our sound editor lives in Minneapolis, composer lives in LA. So it's a lot of working with different people across the country to bring things together. And our webmaster actually lives in Montreal. So we're an international company, I would say.
And are the other people working on it, are they Austrian enthusiasts?
Actually, the crew is not. A lot of I wanted to have kind of a fresh perspective on things, and kind of the target market that I was going for are people in their 20s, 30s who know that something's wrong, but they don't know what it is. And, there's a lot of people look at these generations as being apathetic, and I don't really view it that way. I think that, they're really pissed off about the situation, but they know that, just voting for Bush or Obama isn't really going to make the difference, so they just don't get involved. I think the films are going to be very accessible to people that, are from different backgrounds. You're going to have the Tea Party and Occupy Wall Street that could watch these films and say, oh, okay, a lot of that makes sense to me.
How are you planning on getting them all into the theater?
We're not really doing a theatrical release just because it's not the most cost-effective way to reach people anymore.
Right.
We're more focused on streaming and getting on Netflix and Amazon Prime and Hulu, having digital downloads, that sort of thing. We are going to be touring the documentary, and we're planning on hitting all 50 states, but we're hoping to do 200 screenings over the next couple years with both of the films. So that's really the best way I think I can get the film out there, because with those events we'll be doing Q&As and we'll be able to do podcast interviews and radio interviews and get into local newspapers and stuff. So we really want to be on the road as much as we can and kind of tour it and promote it the same way a band would.
Interesting. So how many people did you interview?
We had 15 interviews, and like I said, there's a wide range of people, from economists and to finance people. We have Jim Grant, who's a financial writer. There's a lot of different people, but the thing that holds them together is they've predicted a lot of what's happened.
I definitely recognized most of the names, people like Bob Murphy.
Yeah, he was actually a script consultant as well, just to make sure that I didn't get any of the numbers wrong or slip on the economics at all.
Do they all mostly agree? Are we talking about points that these people all sort of agree on, or are there differing perspectives?
There are some differing perspectives. It's a lot of the same core beliefs. I decided, rather than just interviewing, some low-level Keynesian economist or something to give the Keynesian argument, that we wanted to have our opponents give the best argument they could. So rather than just getting a low-level interview, I had been licensing a lot of clips from people, like Paul Krugman or, from Ben Bernanke and Janet Yellen and Alan Greenspan, because we really want the people that were in charge of these things, we really want to hear their side and show why it's wrong. We're not just trying to show our side. I think we make a good, honest look at what they're trying to present as their argument as well.
There must be cases where Krugman explicitly sort of addresses the Austrians and attempts to refute them. Do you find anything like that?
Not as many as you would think, actually. But no, he's starting to a little bit more and more, just because it's part of the zeitgeist now. It's in a lot more people's minds. It's still a huge minority in the economics field.
Oh, definitely.
But it's growing every day. And so, yeah, he's actually recently, you can look up, he mentioned some things about Peter Schiff, and Peter responded. It's interesting, Robert Murphy had the idea that to kind of force Paul Krugman's hand into having to debate the Austrian school, he created KrugmanDebate.com. And the idea is it's a crowdfunding thing where you don't have to pay any money unless it actually happens. But if Krugman agrees to debate Robert Murphy, any money that's pledged will go to a food bank in New York. And so I don't know what the latest numbers are, but last I heard it was over $100,000 would go to a food bank in New York if Paul Krugman would just take an hour of his time and debate Robert Murphy. But obviously he's not going to do that.
If you read Bob Murphy's blog, every time Krugman steps out of line, Bob Murphy is there showing us exactly where the contradiction is.
Yeah, that's right.
What he calls a Krugman contradiction with a K, where it's not quite a contradiction per se, but if you were just sort of reading him and interpreting what kind of things he's saying as a layman, then you would believe a lot of things that just aren't so, because he sort of, leads you on a path.
Yeah, absolutely. And Robert Murphy and Tom Woods are actually starting a podcast in the next couple months based on Krugman's writings. And they're just going to, whenever something like that comes about, they're going to do a podcast where they just tear him to shreds.
That's going to be great. So you did these 15 interviews. You had access to all these quite brilliant people. Obviously, you had to go through your questions to make the documentary, but were there things that you yourself were curious about that you got to go right to the source and ask about?
Well, I think Jim Rogers and Marc Faber are some of the most successful investors of the modern age, and their records showed that. So it was pretty amazing to get to sit down with them and just talk to them about, what was going on in the world. I guess since you're from Canada, I'll mention that Jim Rogers, when I talked to him, he talked about the housing. This was a couple years ago, but he talked about the housing bubble in the Toronto area and how things were definitely overheated up there. It's not quite as bad as it was in the U.S. per se, but when I went to Toronto for the Mises Canada's International Conference on Prices and Markets, where I met you, I went to just this cheap burrito fast food place. And when I got a burrito, on the advertisement as you're going through the line was, come sign up and be a realtor today in Toronto. And it's like, is it really to the point where they're recruiting people from the local burrito stand to just be realtors, because that's all the economy is anymore. They're just distorting the structure of the economy so much that such a high percentage of it is going toward real estate and condos, and it's unsustainable, clearly.
Right, yeah. To give a little background, the Canadian central bank basically follows the Fed in its activities. When the Fed inflates, the Bank of Canada inflates. And so, but we didn't have our housing, we have like these apparent housing bubbles in Toronto and Vancouver, but they didn't crash in 2008 or 2006, 7, 8, along with the U.S. market. So they're still going strong and looking ominous.
Yeah, it seemed like they're just building condo after condo in Toronto, and they're not filling any of them. They just keep building them.
Yeah. What kind of things did you find really interesting that you maybe learned while you were making this film?
Well, I guess some of the stuff that I ended up not really focusing on in the film was I went to Estonia over in Eastern Europe, and that's something that people have pointed to as one of the countries that had the best recoveries. And they didn't ramp up government spending; they didn't do a lot of the things that we did. So I decided I was going to go over there and check it out. Partially because Paul Krugman had criticized them for that, and I wanted to explore it myself. And so I was able to interview their finance minister and their social minister and their prime minister. And it was a very eye-opening experience. It was a great experience, but I was pretty disappointed because when I got there, it turned out that in the U.S., they really encourage spending over savings. And there I was excited because they seem to want to encourage savings over spending. And it's not that I think the government should encourage one over the other, but it was just interesting to see them taking a different approach. But when I got there, I found that they didn't really understand economics or why that was. They would see the GDP and the structure of the economy the way it was, and they wanted to promote it, to keep it the way it was. They wanted to just promote that. And so that's why they were encouraging savings, was because 95% of their economy was exports, and they just wanted to promote the exports to avoid having to go through a correction. And it's similar to what we're doing here, even though we're promoting spending. The reason is because we're a consumption-based, I'm talking about the United States now, it's a consumer-based economy, and they just want everybody to spend money, and they think as long as we're spending money, we're going to be happy. But as we've seen around the world, that's not a sustainable policy.
So the Estonia bit was interesting, but didn't quite fit with the rest of the film, is that?
Yeah, and I don't know. It was pretty weird to go in and interview the finance minister in a building that, used to have a finance czar for the Soviet Union. And I mean, it's just weird. They're operating out of some of the same buildings even. And they talk about the free market and they think that they're practicing the free market, but then they're going out and having these economic plans where they're choosing what everybody has to do. The interview with the social minister was interesting because he's actually a graduate of Mises University in the United States, which I couldn't believe that. So I had a lot of fun interviewing him, but he had recently raised taxes on cigarettes and alcohol. And I hammered him on this. I said, I kept hitting him over and over and said, you got to explain this to me. You know better than this. Why would you do this? And he finally admitted that it was because the government was so involved in the healthcare industry that, they just felt like they would be bankrupted if they didn't try to control people's behaviors. So it's really a scary thing when the government gets involved in the healthcare industry, and that's obviously what we're seeing more and more of in the United States today.
And we already have socialized medicine in Canada.
Yeah, exactly.
People do bring up those arguments in favor of paternalism that, well, yeah, if we had a free market, then your decision to smoke would just affect yourself. But we all have socialized healthcare, so we need to control your smoking habit, which, of course,
exactly,
to me is just an argument that's why we should have a free market in healthcare.
Yeah, absolutely. And even though the United States doesn't have socialized healthcare, even before Obamacare, 50 cents out of every dollar in healthcare spending was going through the government at one point or another. So the government's still heavily involved. It's one of the most regulated industries in the country, which, so is housing and finance as well. So I don't think regulations and the government just trying to micromanage these things is going to be a fix.
Right. In Canada, a lot of people really like our healthcare system, and when you say you don't like it so much, they say, "Oh, you want the U.S. system?" And I go, "No, geez, I absolutely do not want that system. I want laissez-faire." But there's not a really easy, it's just the easy comparison to make because here we are and there the U.S. is, and
yep, they try to make it look like there's a false choice. There's only two options when there's obviously far more.
So you go through World War I and the Great Depression. Do you focus on the economics? Do you talk about sort of the economists? Do you talk about what Mises and Hayek were saying, or the rise of Keynesianism? Or
Yeah, absolutely. The idea that we're trying to get across is what these different schools of thought were promoting. So we're talking about what Keynes was saying. We're talking about what Irving Fisher was saying, who was a monetarist and kind of the precursor to Milton Friedman. And then, we're using what Austrians were saying at the time and what they've said since to kind of back up a counter view. We look a lot at the gold standard and how that kind of changed over the first half of the century and eventually was just completely abandoned with Nixon in the early 70s. And then we talk about it in the 30s with FDR, because a lot of Americans don't realize this, but he just made it illegal to possess gold. It was like marijuana in this country. You would go to jail or you would get fined. It was actually the modern day equivalent of almost $200,000 in fines. So the Keynesian policies that they promote, and even the monetarist ones, they're very government-based and very fascist-based, to be honest. It's the government kind of laying down how everything will be, and that's a big contrast to the Austrian school that believes that people should be free to make voluntary transactions with each other. So a lot of people point to fraud and say these bubbles were caused by fraud. And yeah, there was some fraud that existed, and we're not condoning that. Those aren't voluntary transactions. But fraud's always been illegal. That's not something that was deregulated or we need some new regulation making fraud illegal. That's something that we've seen happen time and time again, but it's not something that could have caused something on this magnitude. So I think that if we allow people to be free and make their own decisions, yes, people will lose money on their houses, but you're also going to see people not being willing to loan out all their money for these houses because they don't want to have such a big risk.
Right, and for people who have not listened to all the episodes of this podcast, I did an interview with James Catton about the gold exchange standard and the lead up to the Great Depression. So for a deeper discussion on that, you can go back into the archive. So, Jimmy, how long about are these documentaries?
Well, that was another reason we wanted to split it into two documentaries, is because we wanted to give these topics the attention they deserved. We didn't want to just make weak, quick arguments about them. And we also wanted to include what we felt were the core issues of the past century. And so the first film is 80 minutes, and the second film is 90 minutes. And I think that's something where the longer you get, obviously, the harder it is to keep people's attention, especially with economics and more complicated things. But we use a lot of cartoons. We use a lot of, comedic clips that should make these things accessible to the average person. And we really tried to write it in a way that would allow the average person that doesn't know anything about economics to just sit down for 80 minutes and be like, oh, okay. I know more than most people about what's going on in our economy, and I can kind of protect myself a little bit. Right,
because it seems like if you're going through like a century of economic history and laying the intellectual history over that might be hard to pack into an 80-minute film.
Yeah, of course.
But that's part of the art, right? Being able to
exactly.
Get it all in there. You talk about the stagflation in the 1970s, and you go up through. Would you say you're mainly focused on post-dot-com bubble, the most recent bubble?
Yeah, so the first film, we go really in depth into, okay, what causes bubbles, what caused the housing bubble. And then to kind of verify that, we look back at other crashes. So that's when we go back, we look at 1920, we look at the Great Depression, and like you mentioned, we look at the 1970s, and we see that, okay, there is this consistent thing where the money supply was increased by roughly 50% each time before these crashes happened. So after we're able to see these causes, we also look at the responses to those and see how the government responded in different ways, and how that either delayed or quickened the recession or depression afterwards. So we bring it back up to modern day, and we look at the S&L crisis and the dot-com bubble and the tequila crisis in Mexico in the early 90s. We cover those topics briefly, and it's really in the context of ever since Alan Greenspan became the Federal Reserve Chairman in the mid-'80s, he's just been bailing out Wall Street every chance he can get. whenever there's a problem, he just prints and prints and prints. And so over the course of 20 years, Wall Street realized this, and they were able to, not have the downside. They took the risk out of the situation because they could make money when things were good, and then when things were bad, the bailouts would be there. That brings us up to today with the first film. And then the second film, we look at how we responded to the housing bubble and, focused on what's going on in the world today.
Greenspan, of course, had a reputation as a free market guy, and maybe some people got the wrong idea that Greenspan's policies were somehow free market. Do you sort of address that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's funny. Greenspan wrote an article kind of in favor of the gold standard in the 60s, and a lot of people point to that and talk about it or whatever. But it's really, when you look at somebody's life, what matters is what their actual policies were and the things that they did. And the fact was that this is a guy that created bubble after bubble, and at the end, he was creating $1 billion a day just to keep everything going. And even that didn't work. So I think that we've seen a similar situation today where Ben Bernanke took control and thought that he was going to, be able to just create all this money, bail out all these banks, and he'd be able to find a way to exit out of that and kind of unwind those things. And I think what we found was his exit strategy turned out to be that he just quit and he left. And he left Janet Yellen with a situation that she can't win regardless of what she does, because sooner or later this correction has to come.
He was well respected in academia. He was supposed to be the expert on the Great Depression, and he promised he wouldn't create another one. And
oops.
Yeah, oops. It sort of has. Things are, it's been a long time since the 2000. It's like now 2015, so 7 years down the road, and things still aren't so great.
Yeah, it was the slowest recovery since the Great Depression, if not ever. So, before the Great Depression, that had been the most any government had ever intervened after a crash, and we saw the Great Depression. And here we are intervening more than we ever have again. And, we've had whatever this is, if you want to call it a depression, a recession, a slowdown, doesn't matter what you call it. What matters is how it affects the people. And what we've seen is, I don't like pointing at the 1% because that just takes a whole group of people, and it's not necessarily all of those people that were just given the benefit of these policies. It's the people that got this actual government handouts, like the banks, for example. So I think it's an important distinction to make between the 1% and the people that are getting government favors and getting their money through involuntary means. But what we've seen is that they've had this huge boom, and the luxury car companies, they're enjoying it because they're buying all these nice cars. But what we're seeing is the middle class and the lower classes are struggling. And with all these government, essentially subsidies, we're having to pay for these banks. It's just kind of an absurd thing that you wouldn't think would have ever been the system, but that's where we are today.
Right. When people point to the Great Depression as sort of the ideal response to a crash, I just think you're basically pointing to the Titanic as the ideal response to icebergs. That is we should absolutely look at the Great Depression and then do exactly the opposite of what they did, because they were clearly wrong.
Yeah, that's a great analogy.
Yeah.
And like we talked about earlier, if you look at the downturn in 1920, that was over in a year and a half. It was a very quick correction. Yes, people did lose their jobs, but then they were able to structure into jobs that would be sustainable in the long term, instead of just, getting a job doing the same thing they were doing before, but 6 months later or a couple years later, realizing, oh, wait, that business model wasn't sustainable, so now I have to try to find a new industry again.
Right, and right now we're trying to print money to keep people employed at the jobs they were doing during the boom, right? Which, of course, there was tremendous waste during the boom. We shouldn't be trying to maintain that economy, and yet we are.
Right. We'll use the example of painting, since, I've done a lot of painting over the years. But if everybody sees that painting is extremely profitable because of what the Fed is doing, and they all, drop out of college and spend all their time learning how to be a painter, we're going to have too many painters because of this. And so what we need to do is correct that imbalance and have people go into other industries that they choose, as opposed to just saying, no, we can't let them, we can't make them lose their jobs. We have to keep this going. So we'll just keep printing money and keep housing prices high and keep people painting their houses and buying new homes. But what, as we've seen, it's just unsustainable time and time again. There's no reason to think it's not going to be this time.
So with your second film, which is the bigger bubble, you're sort of having to keep up with essentially a current event. Are there difficulties?
Well, I've certainly had to rewrite it a lot over the last couple of years, but it's interesting because the interviews that I started shooting the interviews in May 2011, and I wrapped them up in May of 2013, and over the course of this time, I asked some different questions to get some different things that I needed, but I had a lot of the same questions that I was asking time and time again, and they've been coming true. I mean, I think it's something where if you watch the raw footage of all these interviews, which we have on our website, you'll see that a lot of the things going on are things that these people have been talking about for years. So I think there's a lot we can learn from them.
Do you address of course, Peter Schiff, there's that video, Peter Schiff was right, that went viral after the 2008 crash, but then he predicted a lot higher CPI inflation than actually occurred, and I think maybe a lot of people look at that and go, oh, well, even a broken clock is right twice a day, and maybe he wasn't such a guru. Did you ask about, CPI inflation and why that particular prediction didn't come true so much?
Yes, absolutely. And I think if you look at other people like Marc Faber, for example, he actually predicted the bottom of the stock market, not just the top of it. So in 2009, he called that low. So, I mean, there's a lot more people than just Peter. But using Peter as the example, I think he's been a lot more right than people realize. And if you talk to middle-class Americans or lower-income Americans, they'll tell you that their grocery prices have been going up, their healthcare costs have been going up. And even now with lower oil prices that we've seen, that was completely offset by healthcare expenses and that sort of thing. So I think that the government doesn't tell the whole truth about inflation, and that's something you've seen in Canada. Mm-hmm. People have seen it from China, and there's no reason to think that the United States is being completely honest with their numbers either, because a lot of their spending is based on those numbers. So if it goes up, then the government has to spend more money on welfare payments and that sort of thing. But as for the argument that we need stable prices, that they made that same claim during the Great Depression, and they made it during the housing bubble. They're saying that we're not seeing really high inflation rates, so everything must be okay. But what we saw with the crash with the Great Depression was all these distortions can be going on in the background because they're still printing money, they're still distorting the economy. They're just only distorting it enough to make sure that prices stays relatively stable. Now, today, they've taken that to the next step, and they say, if prices aren't going up by 2%, we're not happy. But that's just an arbitrary number. They're just kind of throwing darts at a board, whereas the Austrian school doesn't really put that kind of power just in the hands of a few people. They don't think that these different calculations that people make about what the CPI is or what they think the economy is doing, they don't think people have the right to force those beliefs on others and say that we need to just create enough money to reach whatever target. Even if it was Milton Friedman or Paul Krugman making those targets, it doesn't matter. Nobody's smart enough to do that.
Right, and their models kind of focus on CPI, which is just a bundle of final goods. But what Mises, Hayek, and the modern Austrians are focused on are the changes in relative prices. So you have asset prices hitting all-time highs right now. This is February 2015, and CPI fairly flat, or not up to its 2% target, and that's a change in the relative prices, which of course in mainstream models it's not there. And so the Austrians, focusing on these misallocations, are seeing something that is just a total blind spot to a lot of the economics profession.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think a lot of that stems from the tendency of economists to want to group things together, and they want to take their data and just try to classify people and put things into a group. And when you do that, you lose the identity of the individual person making a decision. And I think whenever you do that, it's a very risky proposition, and you end up drawing a lot of conclusions that aren't based necessarily on sound logic.
Yeah, you have Roger Garrison in your film, right?
Yeah, that's right.
I've definitely heard some of his lectures, and I'm currently reading his Time and Money, which is just a really great little book.
That's a great book.
Graphical primer on the Austrian capital theory and business cycles, but really kind of touches on a lot. But one thing he says that I really like is, your aggregation scheme is your theory. You when you add up all investment and call it I, and then all consumption and call it C, you're saying that interesting things can happen to these categories or between these categories, but not within these categories. And, that's sort of, economists sort of aggregate and add things up, or at least macroeconomists do, almost like they're clearing their throats, right? Like, oh, we're just defining terms, this isn't a theory, but it is. It determines what your theory is going to be, how you aggregate things up.
Yeah, absolutely.
Do you show the sort of the Garrison graphical approach?
Not really. We're trying not to show a lot of what people would see at first glance and think, oh, that's economics. We're trying to make it not look that way. And that's not a knock against what he was doing. He was doing important work, but it's just kind of a different approach that we're taking. We're trying to make everything as common sense and simple as we can for people, which I think is something that he was doing just in a different way.
Right. He was trying to explain things to economists, and you're explaining things to regular people who are not economists.
Exactly.
But I'm sure economists would enjoy your film too. When can we expect these films to come out?
Well, we've been doing test screenings. We're going to be doing a test screening in Spokane, Washington here coming up, and we'll be all over. So if you go to our website and get on Facebook and Twitter and follow us or sign up for our email list, we can keep you in the loop on when we'll be coming close to you. We're just about done with the first film, and we have a little bit of work left on the second film. So we're hoping to have them out as soon as possible, but it also kind of depends on what distribution deal we're able to get. So if you want to go to a test screening, or even we're going to do some online test screenings, just sign up for our mailing list, and that'll be the earliest way you're able to see the films.
What's the URL for that website?
It's www.thebubblefilm.com. Facebook and Twitter are the same.
My website is economicsdetective.com, and I'll post an update when you guys get that release going. Thanks for being on Economics Detective Radio, Jimmy.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'd be glad to come back once the films are out.
Excellent. We'll definitely arrange that.
Thanks.
Thank you very much. If you like Economics Detective Radio and you want to support the show, head over to economicsdetective.com/support. There are a couple good ways to support the show. First, you can make a small donation for each episode I release through Patreon. Patreon is a crowdfunding service that allows you to pledge a small amount for each episode, up to a maximum per month. If you don't feel like spending money, and believe me, I know how that is, I am a graduate student, then you can help out by writing a review at iTunes or Stitcher. Reviews help other people find the show, and I really appreciate the people who take time to give feedback. I do read every review, and I really, really appreciate it. So head over to economicsdetective.com/support. Thanks.